Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host Orange Zeppelin, and today I've got a fun little project that I hope will be very helpful if you want to try oil painting or maybe just painting in general. I've been doing little portrait studies in oils recently, and I thought it would make a really fun video because oil painting is kind of intimidating, but once you get used to it, it's actually one of the most forgiving paint mediums out there. So I thought it would be fun to make a video kind of demystifying the process and showing how I set up what are like the specifics of my work process. So let's get our stuff ready. And first of all, we are going to need a surface to paint on. It doesn't really matter as long as it's reasonably smooth. That is going to be the easiest thing to do. Today I'm using a piece of board that I have prepared with gesso, which is essentially a primer. You can take just about anything, smooth it with some sandpaper, get a couple layers of gesso, and you have got yourself a painting surface. The studies that I did last week were actually done on kind of crummy paper that I just put a gesso layer on, and it actually worked perfectly fine. Cardboard is also a good option if you want to do a quick practice painting and you don't want to have that worry that you're wasting a canvas or board, which you're never wasting a canvas or board. You can always sand things down, paint over it. Never feel like you're wasting your time painting on a nice board or canvas if it's just a practice painting. But the cardboard can make it feel a lot less intimidating. Next, we are going to need some brushes. Now, traditionally, I've always separated my oil painting brushes from the brushes I use for things like acrylic or watercolor. I'm not really sure why I do that because I clean all my brushes really well. It kind of doesn't matter. But you do want to clean your oil paint brushes. Well, you want to clean your brushes after oil painting differently than you would your acrylic. You actually have to have a few extra steps in the process, but as long as you're always cleaning your brushes well, they will live a long, happy life. We are going to need a paint thinner because we're using an oil-based paint, and we're going to need a solvent rather than just water in order to thin the paint. I am using odorless turpenoid, and I have this distributed between two little jam jars. This one is my clean paint thinner, and this is just to get the brush wet. This one is going to be for actually cleaning the brush in between colors. Usually what I do if I'm going to use the same brush for a different color, I'm just going to wipe off my brush and then give it a swish in this nice disgusting little jar, and I have them easily marked to tell which one's which. Next, we're going to need a rag for cleaning. Once upon a time, this was a shirt sleeve. Now it's a biohazard. I definitely only use this one for oils. I have an equally gross one that I use for watercolor and acrylic. You will need the plastic lid to a microwavable container if you get hungry and need to heat up some pizza. If you don't have that, you could also use a Seals and Crofts Frisbee. This will, of course, serve as our paint palette. So before we look at our paint, we need our subject. And today we're going to be picking a very handsome subject. We're painting the voice actor, Washington Capitals announcer, and overall cool guy, Wes Johnson. We're painting him for a couple of reasons. One is that if I timed this right, this video should be releasing on his birthday. Also, he is currently teaming up with Fallout for Hope to raise funds to fight Alzheimer's. My family has been affected by Alzheimer's and dementia, as has his own family greatly. I was invited to join the official stream team for Fallout for Hope, which I'm super happy about. And while I don't stream games, what I can do is teach you how to handle dangerous solvents to make pretty pictures. So if this video teaches you anything or entertains you, please consider making a donation. I will have my official Tiltify link set up in the description below and in the comments. Also, If you're wondering how the hell to get my Shea Gorath comic now, that's actually available directly through the Tiltify link, because I was very happy to learn it's actually very easy to set up donation rewards like that. I am bribing you with cool comics to donate to a good cause. So with all that being said, let's get ready to paint. I've got my reference photo that is not easy for you guys to see, what with the ring light and all, but I can see it just fine. Let's hold him at a little angle here. This is a good picture of Wes. It's a nice head-on shot. I also edited this so that we've got higher contrast, more saturated. That's just going to help us with the figuring out our colors. I also have a preliminary sketch made and a little bit of a color model here. This was done in crayons. We are not being pretentious with our materials, though I will say this paper, it's a little too smooth for crayons. Crayons actually need a bit of a toothy paper so the wax has something to grip onto. But we get the general idea what we're doing color-wise. Okay, so I did change my mind at the last minute about what colors I was going to use. Mostly they're this. Oh my god, I've already begun the painting process. Oh my goodness. So in most of the colors I picked are going to be the same. We're picking Elfenbeinschwarz, that is ivory black. We are going to be using titanium white. For the red, I am going with crimson. Burnt umber is mostly going to be for underpainting. And then I also decided I'm going to use some orange in this composition. And I want to kind of just practice mixing those as well as I can. I do also have flesh tint, but I'm going to try not to fall back on this unless I find I'm just not getting the skin tone that I want. Other things you might want to have on hand include some hardware for any paint tubes that are getting very difficult to open. You'll also see I've got one of these paint keys. This one's actually for toothpaste, but these suckers are good for twisting those stubborn ends of the tube up for when you're twisting and things just aren't working and you end up with this hot mess of disappointment. Which, as you can definitely already see, I have oil paint on my hands, so this is a good time to mention that, well, I'm not using any cadmiums. I'm not using any real cadmiums today, so this isn't quite as big of an issue, but skin contact with cadmium isn't good. And some oil paints are actually toxic, so if you're using something like that, you might want to wear gloves. You also might want to work in a well-ventilated space. Consider opening a window. Maybe don't paint in the same room that you sleep like I do. I have had plenty of nights where I was essentially huffing wet oil paint all night. But with all that established, let's squeeze out our paint colors and let's get to making art. I just realized the paint is squeezing out of the side. That's why it's making such a mess. I'm going to get a different tube. So to start off, we are doing an underpainting. Basically, this is the sketch part of the process. I'm using a very thin layer of burnt umber to block in the general shapes. You'll want to keep it light and thin in case we need to cover up a line later, and believe me, we definitely will. And I know we have a very handsome subject, but don't be intimidated. I think Wes Johnson is actually pretty easy to draw. I think he's composed of very clear shapes. His mustache and his beard are going to help us proportion his lower face. And then in places where his hair is a little sparse are gonna help us see the shape of his head. In general, the top of people's ears line up with their eyebrows, and the bottom of their ears are gonna line up just below their nose. So we can see his ears easily, and from there we can form visual lines across his face to help proportion him out. I did regret the strong vertical guideline that I put in the middle of his face, as I had to blend that one out right off the bat. Speaking of bats, he kind of looked like Mo Cronin from Fallout 4 for the first few minutes of the painting. I think that's very appropriate. I started adding in the midtones. There was some brown, orange, and white mixed together for this. I ended up not using a lot of the orange. It was helpful in a few places later on, but mostly I think the orange frisbee was not a good choice in hindsight for mixing orange paint. I couldn't distinguish the paint from the palette. So I was taught with oils and with acrylics to start with the darkest colors and then work my way lighter. I'm not sure that I actually do that. I think sometimes I do. I will always start with a dark color to form some shadows to define the shapes, but usually I'll jump right into the midtones, and from there I kind of go back and forth between the shadows and the midtones, going darker where I need and then blending where I need. The really light highlights I tend to leave until the very end of the process, but you're going to see me add a little bit of highlights throughout the painting. You want to be careful not to overwet your brush with paint thinner, as oil paint will turn into disappointment soup. If you find that you have made disappointment soup, you can just let your painting sit for a day or so and it'll be dry enough to not be a complete pain. It'll also still be a little bit wet. You can still work on it pretty easily. When I first took ceramics back in high school, I had a tendency to overwet my clay, and so I was usually trying to sculpt with mud half the time. This is kind of a similar situation. We don't want to just drown our art. You can, if you're really patient, layer many light washes of paint on top of each other and achieve a very cool glaze effect. Bob Ross also was, in his paintings, he was working wet on wet. He wasn't waiting for anything to dry. He was just like, we're going to sit down and in 30 minutes, we're going to bust out a masterpiece. Well, I'm definitely not going to be painting that fast. I do want to do something that is fairly quick and definitely very fun for practice. Now that underpainting was going perfectly fine, the beginning of the midtones was going perfectly fine, but about 3 to 4 minutes into this painting footage, you're going to see Wes go from Mo Cronin to who in the blazes is that? Because somewhere around here I started to lose the likeness. At this video's 13-minute mark, that's where you, the viewers at home, will most vehemently say, yeah, who the hell is that? Which, don't worry, it does get better. But I did have to stop and think and even pause the recording to sit and ponder, ruminate even, about why I'd gone off track. Paintings often go through a painting puberty, if you will, in which they become painfully awkward. They might smell funny. There's hair in unexpected places. Now the latter is definitely because I have cats and most of my paintings require an extra step of tweezing off the wispy cat hairs that become stuck in the paint. But point is, you may find yourself in a moment of, oh shit, somewhere along the way. Even my most recent self-portrait had a day where I felt like I was doing more damage control than actual painting progress. Somewhere around here, you'll also see me squeeze out another paint color, though I don't use it just yet. You'll see what I do with it a bit down the line. So here I'm trying to work out the root cause of why this doesn't look anything like Wes. I've not been generous enough with his forehead, for one, so I go in and stretch that out. I fixed up his mustache a bit, making it darker towards the sides of his mouth. I round out the bottom of his beard. I added some white to get the face shape more accurate. And I grabbed a few smaller brushes for more precise work for when I got to his eyes. Also, the blue paint actually gets squeezed out here in the video. What's funny is that when I mentioned earlier in the video that I decided against my original plan for what colors I'd use, blue was the color I decided to set aside, and I actually ended up needing it. I definitely was starting to consider that when I said Wes was easy to draw and paint, that might have been rooted in pure hubris. You're seeing this all like 500 times faster than the original, so you're not experiencing quite what I was. I filmed an hour and 10 minutes of painting footage overall, but considering the times that I paused to clean a brush better or just to sit and think It took longer than that overall. I had to look at this in its awkward stage quite a bit. All was well, however, as I consulted with one of my studio assistants, and she was very helpful in getting me through this part. So refreshed and rejuvenated, and with smaller brushes in hand, I started to bring more attention to the eyes, which I hadn't been focusing on as much. And I also went in to try to define his nose a little better. You'll also see my own nose make an appearance a few times since I was leaning in to work on the details. And this is where things started to come back together. After fussing with the eyes for a bit, all of a sudden we were back on track. Just like magic, our boy Wes was here again, never to leave us for some wildly different dude. Half the issue is that I needed to bring that mustache up on the corners of his mouth, give him a nice little smile. Since his upper lip is fully enshrouded, we'll need to focus on both his mustache shape and his eyes for getting the facial expression right. And now that my ego had returned to me, I started to go back in and fill out some more skin tones and places where the underpainting was still visible. I was adding in more raw umber, or maybe I was using burnt umber. Doesn't anyone know how to properly cook umber? But I was adding in more brown, and I started going in with black around his eyes and eyebrows. I also started to do more with his hair. I went in with straight black in a few spots, and I didn't like how that looked at first. It just stood out too much. I also did need to prop the painting up a bit so I wasn't struggling so much with the ring light being hard for me to see. From here, I also gave a little attention to his nose as it was still looking like a amorphous blob. Realizing the highlights on his beard are kind of making it look like it was left unattended with a can of cake frosting. Me too, Wes. I'm starting to realize while rewatching my process that I absolutely do not go from darkest to lightest paint colors, that is, while painting. I've been painting pretty light this whole time. I think that maybe that's something I do because of using watercolors and alcohol markers, where you would do the opposite. You start from the lightest and work your way darker. And with markers, I like to use a lighter color to blend everything along the way. This definitely would not be the first time I broke one of the rules I was taught in school. In just a bit here, you're gonna finally see the return of the blue paint, or rather the first appearance of the blue paint. And that is to give us a background. Now Wes is comfortable in a nice blue void instead of a flat white one. Though I do leave some white around him, like a loose outline, this allowed me to go back in with actual white paint and clear up some of the spots that I wanted to cover. I also put a shirt on him. He's not going to be naked in today's portrait. Of course, you can't be certain if he's wearing pants or not. I actually think Wes would make a terrific life drawing model. A lot of times in life drawing classes, you'll do warm-up drawings where the model changes poses every minute or so. I think he'd be good at that. For some reason, I kind of feel like Wes is the kind of guy who doesn't sit still very well, so he might not want to do like a 2-hour, 3-hour pose. And in his defense, being a life drawing model isn't for the faint of heart. Sitting stone still for multiple hours, completely nude and surrounded by miserable charcoal-covered art students has got to be a surreal experience. I think even this painting would be a long time to sit there and just not change your facial expression. You gotta have a break in there somewhere. Speaking of breaks, I took one around this point to go eat some chicken. I apologize that the lighting is poor from here on out. I did have the evening light shift on me. The natural light was really great for me. Having the ring light on was giving me too much glare. I was having a hard time seeing, so you guys might be getting a very orange look at everything. When I film these videos, my camera is basically set up. My camera and my light is set up at my exact eye level, so I'm pretty much holding my head to the side trying to see around my light. That can always get a little awkward. Every so often I'll actually lean forwards too far and hit the light with my face, or a couple of times if I was using a long brush, I'd hit the light with my brush and I'll make the footage wiggle, which hopefully hasn't been too noticeable. I did later in the video try to turn the light on with a couple different settings just to see if it looks a little bit less orange, but nothing was really looking good. But we are here in the final stretch. I did end up falling back on that flesh tint. I don't remember exactly where in the video I had to squeeze some out, and really the only reason I was holding out on using it is that I wanted to practice my color mixing. When I use acrylics and watercolor, or any medium where I have a lot of colors on hand, I get very lazy and I just use the colors straight out of the tube unmixed. I have a lot less colors available to me with oils, but I did in general want to challenge myself to practice mixing skin tones with only one brown and then several other brighter colors instead of just using a bunch of pre-mixed brown and tan and peach. But pre-mixed colors exist for a reason, and that reason is our convenience. And once I added in the flesh tint, things were definitely looking a lot better. Also, about my blending, one of the things about oil paint is you're not even necessarily layering the paint. It's like you're using one color to push and drag another. The direction of your brush strokes matter when you blend. I think a good comparison would be the smudge tool in Photoshop. You can also use a clean and dry brush to blend wet paint really well. I had some issues with his shoulder. I kind of struggled with the shape, and so I just said, fuck it, it's blending into the background. And I did that on the other side as well, and I actually really like how that turned out. Don't feel like you have to be tethered to your reference image. You can change up poses, you can exaggerate colors. That's partly why I tweaked the colors in my reference image to be a lot more saturated. I think a pretty major part of art is just doing whatever the hell you want. At this point, we're doing a lot of little nitpicky work, adding in some darker spots, fixing up his eyebrows, making his beard look more lush. This is probably my favorite part of the process. It looks good already. Some might say it is even done, but we're going to add all these little extra details to bring it together. A little stronger shadow here, a white highlight there. I do love my white highlights. It's very easy to go overboard, but it is so fun to do. This finally begs the question, how do you know when you're done? You kinda don't. It is possible to overwork an art piece. There is a line that has to be drawn somewhere. I like to say that if you're looking at your piece and you can't come up with what next to do, put the brush down and walk away. You are done. You can also just show it to someone else and ask them what they think. They might tell you that you're done. They might give you a suggestion on what to fix. It's always helpful to have a set of eyes that hasn't been looking at the damn painting for several hours straight. You can even go to bed and look at it tomorrow. But right now, all I have left to do is a few details on the shirt, and I'm going to call it finished. I want to say that this was maybe an hour and 30 minutes of work, not counting the chicken break I took in the middle. I ended up with an hour and 10 minutes of footage, but I know I was working longer than that because I usually pause when I have to sit there and debate what the hell I'm doing or to clean a brush. This was mainly intended as a fun practice piece that would not make Wes Johnson go through all 5 stages of grief upon seeing the finished product. So I think that I did a pretty darn good job in the end. I'm very happy with it. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. I'm going to have some footage at the very end showing it in better lighting. If you did enjoy it, please check out my Tiltify link below. If you did not enjoy it, that sounds like a personal problem. You'll notice a special donation milestone on my Tiltify that will make sense as soon as I release my next video coming later in the month. So, stay tuned. Thank you all for watching and keep making art.